Julius Rosenwald was a great American businessman, extraordinary philanthropist, and a really significant leader in the Jewish and general community.
He was born in Springfield, Illinois in 1862. His parents were German Jewish immigrants. His father had come to this country in 1850 with $20 in his pocket. His youth was essentially unexceptional. Nobody could have foreseen that he was going to become a really gifted CEO of a major U.S. company.
We're in Temple Bris Shalom. Julius Rosenwald's father and his uncle were both presidents of this temple, and Julius Rosenwald was bar mitzvahed at Temple Bris Shalom, which is the Jewish tradition of becoming an adult. Julius Rosenwald grew up across the street from Lincoln's family home. Lincoln was assassinated when Julius Rosenwald was 2.5. He made money by selling pamphlets about Lincoln's tomb.
Lincoln was a great influence on his life. He collected Lincolniana, and he was really interested in Lincoln, in what he had done for African Americans. In 1885, he decided to open his own business in Chicago that manufactured lightweight summer men's suits, a niche market if there ever was one. And it was through that he met Richard Sears, who had started his catalog company in Minneapolis and then moved the business to Chicago in the early 1890s.
Sears wanted the quick kill, the big money event. Rosenwald had a long game where Sears might have been flighty. Rosenwald was careful, very cautious.
Sears was a brilliant marketer, but he didn't really know all that much about business. He would issue a page in the catalog for suits, and then he would sit back and wait to see whether the orders were coming in. He didn't have the suits on hand, and so he called up Mo Newberg, who was JR's boss at the time, who was in New York, and he asked Newberg who could he go to get very inexpensive men's suits. And Newberg said, well, the man you want is Julius Rosenwald, and he's right there in Chicago. And so that's how the two men ended up meeting. So when in 1895, JR and his brother-in-law decided to buy 1/2 of Sears Roebuck, he didn't really have to put much money down because Sears owed him the money for the suits. He started out as a vice president for haberdashery, if you will. In 1908, Richard Sears decided for a variety of reasons that he wanted to leave the company, and JR became president and CEO.
Julius Rosenwald, although the chief executive, he ate with employees in the employees' dining room. He said people worked with him, not for him. He provided benefits, which was unheard of in his time, and that was where he found his success.
Richard Sears was a bit of a huckster. This was common in the catalog business, and there were pages in the catalog selling nostrums, patent medicines. There was something that in an early catalog selling an electric belt, which was supposed to help in weight loss. It obviously didn't. But JR didn't like these, and so one of his first acts as CEO in 1908 was to set up a testing lab so that every single item that went into the Sears catalog was tested to make sure that the description of it in the catalog was absolutely honest. And this was something of an innovation. But JR felt very strongly about this. JR was incredibly successful. I mean, he became a multimillionaire, and he made Sears into the Amazon.com of its day. at least for a part of his life, Judaism was not terribly important to him. He got married in 1890 to a Jewish woman, Augusta, or Gussie. Initially, she was kind of shocked that he didn't observe the Jewish holidays. He insisted on working. But later on, he fell under the influence of Rabbi Emil Hirsch, and he started attending Sinai Temple, going to as many services as he could.
Rabbi Hirsch was not only his friend, he was his rabbi. And getting back to Jewish values, tzedakah, which means righteousness and justice, but is often interpreted as charity, is in fact a commandment. It's a mitzvah. And it essentially says that you must take care of others.
He was visited by a delegation from the Washington YMCA. The YMCAs were not just places of recreation, they were also dormitories. If you were a young black coming to Chicago around 1910, you couldn't stay in a black hotel. There was no such thing. And you couldn't stay in a white hotel because you wouldn't be admitted. So there was a real need for a black YMCA. JR was told this, and he thought about it for about 5 minutes, and then he announced to his astonished interlocutors that he would give $25,000 to any YMCA in the country that wanted to build a black YMCA and could raise an additional $75,000.
It was he who developed the idea of matching funds. Before that, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies would either give large sums or not. Rosenwald thought that if you had skin in the game, there was a very good chance that the project would take off and mature.
The German Jews had a penchant for organization. And so right from the beginning, as they came, they began setting up communal institutions to take care of things. An orphanage for people who didn't have parents, an organization that helped people who were poor, an organization that helped people find jobs, and on and on. And he and others said, it's very good that we have all these things, but it's not in order. It's more ad hoc that it should be. And so the night before Passover in the year 1900, he and 10 other leaders came together and they kind of hammered out a decision of why don't we bring all of these together. And the Associated Charities of Chicago was founded, which is the Jewish Federation today.
In 1911, he took some members of his family to Europe to visit his daughters who were finishing school in Germany. And my mother and her brother were pretty bored there. And so JR said that he would go one day a week and do whatever each child wanted to do. And there was only one thing that my Uncle William wanted to do, to go to this new museum that had opened in Munich, and it was called the Deutsches Museum. And it was a prototype of the Museum of Science and Industry. It had a coal mine and interactive exhibits. William thought this was just the greatest thing he'd ever seen. So JR got the idea that a museum of this kind ought to be built in Chicago. At first, the board decided that it should be called the Rosenwald Industrial Museum. And he thought about that for a very short period of time. And then he said, no, I don't want that. I want the name changed. He felt that it should be the People's Museum. It should belong to everyone. In 1919, he had created a foundation called the Julius Rosenwald Fund. It was the newly appointed head of the foundation, Edwin Embry, who suggested that he give grants to deserving blacks and whites who were doing really extraordinary things. Some 900 Rosenwald Fellows were created mostly after JR's death in 1932, but they included many notable people, including Maya Angelou.
The Rosenwald Fund is a veritable who's who of Harlem Renaissance luminaries. There was Langston Hughes, who is perhaps the father of Black poetry in the 20th century. There's also Zora Neale Hurston, anthropologist, writer, scholar. Augusta Savage, one of the great sculptors of the era. John Hope Franklin, one of the great Black historians of the 20th century. There were lots of folk who were recipients of the fund, and they managed through the fund to be able to create their works and get them recognized.
I think his wishes not to have his name on buildings, to give anonymously, and to have his foundation end after 30 years is why we don't know more about Julius Rosenwald, the philanthropist. And it's important to get his story out because he did make such a difference in people's lives. We all can be inspired by Rosenwald, how he gave and how he lived, how he looked at the world and create a world of opportunity and help create a world of kindness.
It was briefly the case that after the Civil War, things got better for blacks in the South. But not very many years after the war ended, there was a backlash where these gains were slowly obliterated and things got a great deal worse.
Julius Rosenwald visited the South and was horrified by the lack of anywhere near equality in terms of educational opportunity.
The two books that motivated him toward broadening his philanthropy were Graham Brooks's biography of William Baldwin entitled An American Citizen, and even more so, Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery, 1901. It wasn't until they met in 1911 that they really developed a deep friendship.
When Booker T. Washington suggested that J.R. build schools for African American children in the vicinity of Tuskegee, J.R. thought this was a good idea, but Sears already was selling kit homes where you could order a house, it would come in pieces, and you put the thing together, and then you had a house. And so he thought, well, if we're selling kit homes, we can do the same thing with schools. So he proposed this to Booker T. Washington, and Washington said, no, that is not the idea, because we have to get the community involved. And the way to do that is to give some of the money, but not all of it. And the black community has to contribute its own money or land or something to these schools.
And what's interesting there too is this organizing skill. So as he looks at the problem, he says, well, the local governments in the South, these are Jim Crow governments, if they had interest in making educational opportunities equal, they would have done it all by themselves. And so he comes up with this third concept where, okay, the government should come up with about a third of the money, and I'll come up with about a third of the money. And the individuals, the African-American families, sweat equity. You help in the building and the construction. And again, sounds simple, pretty brilliant. And it worked. And you see that connection between business acumen and philanthropic vision that I think Rosenwald really personified.
As a result of this program, there were over 5,500 schools that were built in these 15 southern states between 1913 and 1932.
I still could not go to a white school in 1951 when I was 6 years old. And thank goodness there was a school in Providence, Kentucky. All I knew is that it was the best school. It was so big. It was like first grade through 12th grade. It was just a wonderful, warm place. We had the lunch lady who came and brought food. We had my grandfather who was the custodian. And I do remember that my grandmother, they would do quilts and sell them to make sure that we brought in our third for our school. These schools were for us, for the community. If you look at the pictures of those schools, they had big windows where the sun, would come in, which was exactly opposite of the little one-room, shabby kinds of schools. They were very nice. That's where the basis for some of the Julian Bonds, the Martin Luther Kings, the Rosa Parks, because that was where we were able to really learn the things that could contribute to not only our communities, but to the world. And now I became a teacher too. So it just kind of all fit together. I'm so grateful. I mean, I know it sounds mushy, but I can't help it. It's like, thank you, Mr. Rosenwald. Yeah.